Hello Street Snappers and welcome to this latest new format magazine style video. In today's edition we've got a book review. I will answer some of your questions. We'll have a look at truly pocketable street photography cameras. We'll critique an interesting image of yours and there'll be a few tips and techniques for you. And you'll probably be relieved to know that this video is not sponsored by Squarespace, even though I do use Squarespace and I quite like it. Just a reminder that these videos are based on my own personal views and I don't pretend to know everything about everything. When I started making these videos a couple of years ago, I was given some very valuable advice from a well-known YouTuber who said, if you only do one thing, be true to yourself. Don't try to please everybody because you'll end up pleasing no one. And how true is that? So that's always been my intention. It's a no-nonsense, what you see is what you get approach. And maybe that's why I'm a professional photographer and not a professional YouTuber. Who knows? Now, before we start, have you heard about my street photography newsletter? If not, please sign up. It's free and there's some juicy content. Just go to StreetSnappers.com and you'll find a sign up link. And I will pop that link below for you. So let's start today's video with a book. What am I reading this week? Well, I've always been a fan of Doogie Wallace's work and I'm really enjoying his latest book, EastEnded. This body of work was shot in London's East End in an area called Shoreditch. And
when you're ready.
if you're not familiar with the area, you may well have heard of Brick Lane. And this book depicts a vibrant local community against a backdrop of street art and graffiti. And it's an area where rich meets poor, east meets west, where the sheer amount of colour assaults the eyes. This is an area I know well, and I run workshops here every few weeks, and I think Doogie has really captured the essence and the spirit of Shoreditch here. You can almost smell the streets, to cannibalise a well-used Bruce Gilden quote. So this was all shot in colour, with Doogie's trademark, in-your-face, brash approach, with flash, and it's wonderful. To me, this is street photography, and as is often the case with Doogie's work, there's a strong nod to the documentary. I see a lot of work shot in this area, and I think it's a common mistake some people make, but an understandable one, is not getting close enough to the subject matter. Not so with this project. You can almost smell the breath of some of Doogie's subjects. He brings them into close proximity with the viewer, which gives you a real sense of intimacy and being there. The book's published by Dowie Lewis, and I've popped an Amazon link to the book in the descriptions below. Do have a look, it's a great book. So on to your questions now. And my first question is from Mr. Woof from Hamburg. And I think we have to assume his bark is worse than his bite. So he asks, do you use presets for street photography? And if so, which ones? Well, there's a very short answer to that. No. Look, I have nothing against presets per se, but they're just not for me and they've never been part of my workflow. The truth be known, I hate spending time in Lightroom or Photoshop when it's time I could be spending out there on the streets. And yes, I know that presets can actually save you time, but it's just not how I work. It feels like you're buying somebody else's creativity. You're buying another photographer's approach. It's not for me. Now, even if I made my own presets, I'd still feel like I was doing too much to an image to make it viable. To me, and I said this so many times in these videos, street photography is all about authenticity. So I'm not saying presets are necessarily a bad thing, but they're just not for me. So no, I don't use presets and I won't be trying to flog you some anytime soon. Right, another question, and this one is from David in Reading, who asks, what was the first camera you owned and at what age? Well, I was 13 and my first proper camera was a Zorky 4, a sort of Russian Leica copy. And I remember seeing this camera in a shop window and it was 12 quid. My parents wouldn't buy it for me and said I needed to get a Saturday job and save up. So that's what I did. I persuaded the camera shop guy to take a small deposit and put the camera away on a shelf for me until I had enough money to pay for it. And I worked weekends in a petrol station for a few months until I had enough money to pay for this camera. And this was a true 35mm rangefinder camera. It had a 50mm f2 lens, Helios lens, I think. I love that camera. I can still smell the leather from that camera case. And cameras like this are great to learn on. And okay, I accept that film isn't cheap anymore. But if you can afford to shoot film, it's such a visceral and joyful experience. And I'd recommend it to anyone. I won't bang on about it now, but in a future magazine video, there will be a piece specifically about shooting film. So another question, and the next one is from Antonella from New York, who asks, which other YouTube channels do you personally watch? Wow, what a great question. Well, where do I start? I'm not a great fan of the POV style videos, which I don't think tell us very much. Mainly because the pictures taken at that particular time are usually pretty poor. I don't like the clickbaity style videos either. You know, why I sold my X100V, why I've gone to Leica, why Sony cameras are the best. And I don't like the sort of the review videos. A guy hires a Leica for 2 weeks and then does a review and claims it's the best thing since sliced bread and says we all must go out and buy one. Maybe I'm being harsh, but you did ask. So what do I watch? Well, I'm not really into gear channels, but I think Matt Osborne, Mr. Leica, is very good. Tom Humble's channel is an informative and easy watch. There's Ted Forbes, of course, The Art of Photography, great channel. Alex Kilby, Tanya Hopper's analysis of the great street photographers is quite watchable. If you're into film, analog, Grainy Days is fun and quirky if you're into film shooting. And then there's Samuel Street Life, that's often fun, and I always watch that. Other than that, there's not really much else I subscribe to. And when this question came in, I did a YouTube search using street photography as a search term. And about 80% of what came up wasn't what I would call street photography. And it was all a bit depressing, really. And I'm not going to get into definitions of street photography here because I know it will upset some people. Not that that really bothers me, but I'll save it for a future video, a controversial one. But this is all in my personal opinion, of course, and I'm sure some people will shout at me for expressing it. So the final question for today is one I'm going to answer while I'm out and about. Jenny from Bridlington in North Yorkshire, great place, asks, do you ever shoot at the beach or in seaside towns like Martin Parr? Well, I'm not sure about like Martin Parr, but I do shoot at the seaside a lot. I'm actually a big fan of Martin's work, though I know not everybody else is. I'm a fan of most of his work. I don't know if you saw, only a couple of days ago, there was an article in a newspaper which was showing Martin's work from Glastonbury Festival this year. And I don't know, I don't think it was all that good, really. I think I expected more from Martin. Anyway, I've just returned from running a documentary workshop in Blackpool, which, if you don't know it, is a seaside town in the northwest of England, and it's quite a wild place. And while I was there, I managed to record a few words, Jenny, in answer to this question. So here I am in Blackpool for a day's street photography. You can probably see the tower in the background, you can see the beach, the sea behind me. Blackpool is a fantastic place for street photography, and there is just so much to go at. And of course you've got all the seaside cliches, not the pigeons, what are they called? The seagulls, the gulls, the fish and chips, the three piers here in Blackpool, the kiss me quick hats, all the cheap tat, lots of copious drinking and consumption, ice creams, beer. It's all excessive.
and it's just a really good place to shoot. And of course, Martin Parr made a he almost made a reputation out of shooting the English seaside with his project called The Last Resort, which was shot in New Brighton on the Wirral. So do give seaside shooting a try. I think one of the most important things you've got to bear in mind is to shoot with a theme in mind. You've really got to do seaside photography with a project. Don't just rock up and shoot aimlessly. Think about what you're doing and work to a project. For example, I've got several projects on the go at the moment. One is all about life on piers. Another project is all about the decay of the English seaside, the dilapidation, the rust, and everything looks a bit tired, and this kind of faded Victoriana, I think, just really interests me. And it's a great idea for a project. You've really got to blend in and not look like a photographer, and you've really got to look like a tourist, and if you can, look like everybody else, which is actually quite hard in Blackpool. But use a small camera. I use this little Fujifilm X-F10 because it's tiny. I don't look like a photographer with this. I look like a tourist, and nobody bothers about me, and nobody really notices me. But it is really quite important to blend in. So come to the seaside, the English seaside. It's a great place. I run workshops in Blackpool. I do street photography workshops and also in-depth documentary workshops over 3 days. But do give the seaside a try. It is a terrific place for street photography.
So yes, Jenny, I do shoot the seaside and I love it. In fact, one of my ongoing projects is called Something in the Water, and it's all about capturing the essence of Blackpool in all its glory. I run about 6 workshops a year in Blackpool and in Brighton, both seaside towns, so if you fancy trying some seaside shooting, do come along. StreetSnappers.com. Now, you know this isn't a gear channel, and you won't be seeing any in-depth gear reviews from me. But sometimes gear is worth a mention, in a small way. And today I'd like to talk about the role of truly pocketable cameras in street photography. So your questions might go something like, is a truly pocketable camera going to be good enough? Is it worth having something separate from my main camera? Is my iPhone good enough? And what are the options for truly pocketable cameras? What is out there? What can I go and buy? So, first question, is a tiny camera good enough in terms of image quality or features? Well, yes, depending on the camera, of course, it's usually more than adequate. For several years, I used the humble little Fuji X70, which was such a brilliant camera for street, and I can't for the life of me understand why Fujifilm discontinued this line. They've just let Ricoh in through the back door to steal the market. So the X70 has 16 megapixels, which is just fine for me. Maybe not brilliant in low light, but brilliant in every other respect. Fixed 28mm lens, perfect. Pixel count isn't everything. Is it worth having a second pocketable camera? Well, if you've got the money, yeah, I think so. There are times when I'm not specifically going out to do street photography. Maybe I'm on a shopping trip, or maybe en route to a meeting. I probably don't want to have the size and the weight of a regular camera, but something like my little GR3, I can leave home with that, and it does feel like I have a proper camera with me. So what about mobile phones? Well, I know there are plenty of people who can take amazing pictures with these things, but I'm afraid I'm not one of them. They're fine for parties or when you've had 6 pints of Guinness, but I find the picture-taking experience with phones a bit clumsy, and by the time I've unlocked the thing, opened the right app, held it the right way round, pressed the button, the picture opportunity is probably gone. And, well, I'm a photographer, and I want to do things right. Things that feel right, to me at least. And yes, I know the image quality from these things is now amazing, but optically, I don't think they will ever make the grade. And, you know, you compare this tiny little bit of plastic with something from Carl Zeiss or Fujifilm or Sony or whatever, there's no competition. So I do think they can do a job in an okay sort of way. But if photography is your passion, then it's a bit of a joyless experience, in my view. So what are the options for truly pocketable cameras? I can't claim to know the extent of the market. I can only really talk about my experiences. I think the market leader in terms of street photography, quite rightly, is the GR3, whether it's in its original 28mm form or the X model like this one with its 40mm equivalent lens. And I generally wouldn't leave the house without it. Fujifilm did have a go at this market recently with the XF10, which was meant to be, I think, a kind of replacement for the X70. And you saw my earlier clip at the seaside, which was shot, I mentioned the X10. But that model never really took off, and it was never going to be a substitute for the X70. But it's a good enough little camera, and you should be able to get hold of a used one for about 200 quid. And it's worth buying. Again, fixed 28mm equivalent lens, so 18mm in APS-C terms. So the XF10, great little camera. I'd still recommend the X70, although I think the cult status has sent the used market through the roof, and you probably pay quite a bit for it now. Other than that, well, I know Canon makes some decent little compacts, and the dinky little Sony RX100 range is pretty good, but these don't feel to me like proper photographer's cameras, if you know what I mean. But they do a good enough job, I think. But if you have a recommendation that other viewers would be interested in, please pop it in the comments below. I'm sure we'd all love to hear about your experiences and about what you think. And by the way, when I talk about pocketable cameras, I don't include the likes of the Fuji X100 range or the Leica Q2. Good though they are, they just never feel right in a shirt pocket or a trouser pocket. And I once had my X100 in my back pocket and sat on it, which didn't end well for me or for the camera. So on balance, I think it's worth having a separate pocket camera, and my money would be on the Ricoh, either the latest GR3 or the older but still very capable GR2, which you can get for a reasonable price now, I think, on eBay and the like. So, our next segment, tips and techniques. Here's a fun quick tip for you. 2 uses for an elastic band. Firstly, how many times do you take a dead battery out of your camera, dump it in your bag, and then try to put it back in the camera later on in the day? I used to do this all the time. But now I simply put an elastic band around my fresh batteries. So when the battery's dead, I take the band off, chuck the battery in the bag. So no elastic band equals no power. You never put a dead battery in your bag again. My next elastic band tip is all about self-flagellation. One of the worst habits of street photographers is hesitation. You see a shot, then you think, shall I, shan't I? What shall I do? You hesitate and you miss the shot. We all do it to a greater or lesser degree. But try this hot tip from a behavioural psychologist friend of mine, who, by the way, is going to come and talk to us about the psychology of street photography. And he will give a psychologist's perspective, which I think we'll find very interesting and useful. So here's a tip from him. Wear an elastic band on your wrist, and every time you hesitate, you give yourself a big, slightly painful twang. The idea is that over time, this regulates your hesitation instinct, and it conditions you out of hesitating. It's a bit of fun maybe, but it's got to be worth a try, hasn't it? Each month, I'll choose an image from a member of the StreetSnappers collective and we'll analyse it. If you haven't come across it before, the collective is the best community for street photographers. It's a very active and engaged group of about 750 photographers, all of whom have completed one of my workshops. And that's the essential criteria for membership. You do a workshop, you can join the collective. Otherwise, I'm afraid you can't. So this month, we're going to have a look at this image by Paul Wilkinson, who's from Leicester. I liked this picture the first time I saw it. There are some strong Saul Leiter cues here. The vertical framing, the warm colour palette, the compressed perspective, which creates a sense of detachment and a feeling of voyeurism. And the concept of leaving something out, holding something back from the viewer, which creates a sense of intrigue or mystery. Then there's this guy's stylish wardrobe. And the icing on the cake here is the half-naked woman he's looking at on the newspaper page. I think Paul's really nailed it here. Now, I know Paul quite well. He's done a couple of workshops with me, and I know that he started his street photography in the usual way, looking for moments and shooting candidly in the streets in a more full-on style. But then he had a bad experience shooting on the streets of his hometown, Leicester, and he was shoved against the wall and threatened for taking somebody's picture. And this is enough to put anybody off street photography for life. And I know Paul took a few steps back at that point, but he bounced back, albeit shooting a different kind of street photography. And he's now much more influenced by the work of people like Saul Leiter, Ernst Haas, shooting more aesthetically based work in a more considered, laid-back way. I think he finds this much less challenging. And he's found an approach that works for him, which is surely what street photography is all about. But with this image, the devil is in the detail, and I mentioned this before, I think it's the newspaper page which really makes this image complete. Paul shot this in the St James area of London using his Fuji X Pro 3 with a 56mm 1.2 lens, fabulous lens, especially for this kind of street photography. And he used the Fujifilm classic negative film simulation, which I quite like. I find it a bit harsh sometimes, but I've seen a lot of Paul's work and I think he uses it well. I've got to say, with the sort of work that Paul is currently doing, this lens, this 56 1.2, is an absolutely cracking lens. Doesn't get much better than this. So there's not a huge amount to criticise with this image, if I'm honest, and I absolutely love it. Maybe there was a better composition to be had, and I don't know whether Paul worked the scene or this was his first and only shot. I guess in the ideal world, the hand would be positioned a little more to the right and we'd see a little bit more cigar smoke, but that's nitpicking, and hey, it's a cracking shot. Well done, Paul. You can see more of Paul's work on his website, and there's a link on the screen here, and I will pop a link below. And finally, this is what they used to say on the 10 o'clock news when they got to the end of the main stories and wanted to leave you satiated with a few tasty tidbits. So, just a couple of snippets before we finish. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have spotted lots of street photographers wearing these little badges. Hopefully you can see it on the screen here. Well, these are members for the StreetSnappers. These are for members of the StreetSnappers collective to wear on their bags or jackets. And the idea for these was suggested by a member of our collective, thank you Robin, who pointed out that there are hundreds of collective members out there shooting on the streets of London or wherever in the world, and they won't necessarily recognise each other, but if they're all wearing this badge, the idea is that they'll make some sort of connection and get chatting. So if you see one of these badges, you know you're looking at a really nice person, so do stop and have a chat. And while we're on the subject of the StreetSnappers collective, I'm really proud to show you this photo book, which contains images by members of the collective, all shot last year. It's a kind of greatest hits, and it's now an annual publication. And if you fancy picking up a copy, I will pop a link below. Finally, a question for you. What's a collective noun for a group of street photographers? What do we call them? I'll just let that one hang, and it would be fun to hear your thoughts. What should we call a group of street photographers? What is the collective noun? Pop your answers below, and I'll publish a selection of my favourite of them on my street photography blog, which again you'll find at streetsnappers.com, by the way. Lastly, as always with these videos, I'll leave you with a quote, and this one is from the wonderful Melissa O'Shaughnessy. And this really relates to the fear of street photography. I want the picture more than I fear the consequences. What What a great quote. A woman after my own heart. So that's all for today, folks. This week I was intending to bring you a copy about William Klein and what we can learn from him, but I'm still working on that, and I will have it ready for you next month. I'm now off to do a long weekend of workshops, and if you fancy joining me, do come along. I have space in Lisbon for a 2-day workshop in the first weekend of September, so not far away. And I also now have a space for a 1-to-1 workshop on Friday, the 1st of September in Lisbon. So if you fancy that, have a look at the website. Lots of details on there, streetsnappers.com. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you back here next time. Bye for now.